Do you know what the Taliban is?
Do you know how he related to the history of Afghanistan in the recent world?
No?
Shall we go to class today?
Afghanistan is territory that has historically created problems for countries and even empires that have tried to conquer it. Remember Alexander the Great? So, he is one of the oldest invaders known to have invaded Afghan territory by the elderly in 330 BC. After that we would have invasions by the Abbasid Arabs, Mongols, Khazari-era Russians, the British Empire and more recently the Soviets in 1979 and the US-led coalition in 2001. For this class, we will talk about the last two that, in my opinion, are more important for understanding today's reality, although, of course, we cannot exclude the historical importance of previous events. As you can see, the departure of the United States after 20 years reinforces the way in which the country is usually called the cemetery of empires.
In 1979, in the context of the Cold War, at the very end of the period known as the Dayton, the Soviet Union invaded the country. This invasion was one of several facts of that year that helped to ignite feelings and rekindle the half-dormant Cold War. The invasion ended up being the result of an internal crisis generated by disputes between the communists who governed the country. These disputes threatened Soviet influence and this bothered Moscow, which ended up promoting the invasion. You might be thinking, but how important was the country for the Soviets to be so interested?
I already know, the country is rich in oil.
Not exactly. Not that Afghanistan doesn't have oil, but nothing like that justifies such great interest. The question is more of logistics than the richness of its natural resources. In other words, the country is a transit zone for the flow of oil coming from other states, for example, its neighbor, Turkmenistan, which for you to have an idea, has almost 60% of its exports concentrated in oil, derivatives and natural gas. But then, with this invasion, there was a reaction from the United States, within the logic of MAD, that is, without direct confrontation between the two superpowers. The form of action was to support internal resistance, which was largely concentrated on the warlords of Afghanistan, the so-called Mujahideens.
That support would arm them, train them, finance them, to make life hell for the Soviets.
And as the late former Soviet President Mikhail Gorbachev said recently, invading Afghanistan was not a good idea. And as we saw that had already happened at other times in history, once again, this time in 1985, the Soviet Union withdrew from Afghan territory. It is obvious that we cannot forget that they faced, in addition to the Afghan resistance, serious internal problems, but that is not the subject of this class. Well, victory over the Soviets with US help doesn't make Afghans friends with Uncle Sam. The consequence is the strengthening of self-esteem and the growth of an appreciation of religiously based cultural foundations. In this spirit, a group of students, from the Pashtun ethnic group, called the Taliban, appears. Just to be clearer, Taliban means student. In his case it would be a kind of Islamic theologians who imagined a society guided by Islamic laws. The group had a meteoric rise facilitated by the more liberal characteristics of the government, which bothered much of the Afghan religious culture. For you to have an idea, the group created in 1994 came to power in 1996, taking over Cape Town.
The president at the time, unlike today, did not run away, and I think he regretted it, because if I said he was assassinated I would be unfair with what happened to him.
I won't even mention it here, as I know there may be minors watching and the reporting of certain violent scenes like that can traumatize some. From that moment on, the group established a theocratic, very orthodox government, making its own interpretation of Sharia. But the teacher, what would Sharia be? Well, literally translating, that would be more or less the clear path to the water, but I know that's not what you want to know. So come on, Sharia is the legal system of Islam. It is composed of guidelines from the Quran and conclusions of scholars of Islam. These conclusions are jurisprudence or called factuous. Since 1996 the Taliban even bothered, but was solemnly tolerated by the West, but its territory with special characteristics began to become shelter for groups that wanted to hide in nothing better than the mountain ranges cut by countless labyrinths of caves. It is in this context that Afghanistan ends up becoming a kind of base, including training, for the group led by the Saudi millionaire, former Afghan and Soviet resistance fighter Osama bin Laden.
In other words, Afghanistan becomes a haven for Al-Qaeda.
It is important to point out that Al-Qaeda's terrorism was more fluid, different from the models of terrorism that were known. Soon, he wasn't in territory, didn't know where to find him. When the attacks on the Twin Towers on September 11 took place, the war against terror began at a level never seen before, and the only more concrete information that was available about the terrorist group responsible for the attack was that it had the support of the Taliban. And then, with the authorization of the United Nations Security Council, the United States, leading a coalition of countries, invades Afghanistan with the objective of overthrowing the Taliban and dismantling the support network for Osama bin Laden, who, although hunted, would only be captured and killed in 2011 in Pakistan. It was at that moment that the world became aware of the Taliban regime in Afghanistan and how society in the country lived under the regime, especially women, who were subjected to a life radically opposed to the freedom of Western women. What was most shocking was the use of the burqa, which covered the woman's entire body, leaving her face only partially exposed behind a kind of screen, as you can see here in the image. The group is quickly overthrown and flees to the Afghan mountains, being the target of constant attacks and gigantic bombardments against the mountains that protected them. The approach of Western countries was not just military occupation, they started a true cultural revolution, installing beauty salons, enrolling women in schools and colleges, which were previously prohibited, and men were now even allowed to shave. But the group remained hidden, carrying out attacks against the occupying forces and against the democratically elected government to govern the country.
The United States was unable to dislodge the Taliban, and the costs of maintaining the occupation, in addition to the death of American soldiers, bothered American public opinion, which ended up pressing the governments for the withdrawal of troops from the country.
But it was not an easy task. Promises ended up not being fulfilled.
It was the case with Obama, it was the case with Trump. In order for us to arrive at the reality that we see today on television, with the presence of Taliban troops, through the streets of Afghanistan, through the streets of Kabul, a long process was necessary. It established its tripartite negotiation, United States, Afghan government and Taliban.
In that negotiation, the Taliban promised to give up the use of force in exchange for American support against Daesh, the Islamic State. On the contrary, from the United States they would withdraw their troops from the country and thus there would be no bloodshed. Negotiation was something unthinkable until recently, and this demonstrates that American efforts in the Afghan conflict ended up not working out.
They even tried a responsible withdrawal, trying to do something similar to what had happened there in Vietnam, that is, transferring to the Afghans the responsibility of defending themselves against the Taliban.
The result was the same. American troops left and the enemy regained control, making history the image of yet another country that failed to win a war on Afghan soil.
Except for the subtle differences inherent in the two historical moments, I make an observation so that we do not fall into anachronisms.
The impression is that the Afghan people are trapped in a time loop.
We're done here. If this video was useful to you, leave a comment, like it, and of course, if you haven't subscribed yet, subscribe to the channel and activate the bell.
If you want to know my courses, I left the links in the video description, in case you are interested.
Okay guys, big hug.